The man who told her to leave the room would spend the next hour praying she came back. The words hung in the air like a warning no one had heard in time. Alexander Hayes slammed the leather folder onto the conference table, and the sharp sound echoed through the 42nd floor boardroom overlooking downtown Manhattan. No one spoke. No one moved. The deal that was supposed to secure the future of Hayes Global Holdings was unraveling right in front of him. 12 months of negotiations. Hundreds of millions of dollars in projected revenue. The largest international partnership of his career. And now, less than 30 minutes before the final signatures, everything felt dangerously unstable. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Gray clouds rolled across the skyline. The city below continued moving, unaware that one of the biggest business agreements of the year was balancing on the edge of collapse. Alexander loosened his tie and glanced around the table. Attorneys, executives, advisors. Everyone looked nervous. Everyone except the foreign delegation seated across from him. Their expressions remained unreadable. Calm, patient, almost too patient. A silver coffee tray appeared beside the conference table. Emma Sullivan stepped quietly into the room. Her black server uniform was simple, professional, easy to ignore. Most people did. She carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that rarely attracted attention until it was too late. One by one, she placed fresh coffee beside the attendees. Her movements were smooth, precise, almost invisible. Alexander barely looked at her. To him, she was part of the background. Another employee in another uniform. Another person whose job was to serve and disappear. Emma noticed the tension immediately. She noticed the stiff shoulders, the nervous glances, the way one executive kept tapping his pen against a legal pad. She noticed something else too. One of the foreign representatives leaned toward another and quietly spoke a sentence in Arabic. Emma froze for the briefest moment. Not enough for anyone to notice. Just enough for her attention to sharpen. The men exchanged a glance. One nodded. Then both returned to their professional smiles. Emma continued pouring coffee. Her expression never changed. Across the room, Alexander stood and began speaking. His voice was strong, controlled. The voice of a man accustomed to leading billion-dollar negotiations. Today marks the beginning of a partnership that will benefit both organizations for decades. Heads nodded around the table. Polite smiles appeared. Everything looked normal. Yet Emma felt an uncomfortable weight settle in her stomach. The sentence she had overheard replayed in her mind. Once, twice, 3 times. Something about it felt wrong. Not the words themselves. The intention behind them. She placed the final cup on the table. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through the room. Alexander continued speaking. The presentation moved forward. Slides appeared on the massive screen. Revenue forecasts. Expansion plans. Growth projections. Applause followed each section. To everyone else, the meeting seemed successful. Emma wasn't so sure. She looked toward the delegation again. One man adjusted a Swiss watch beneath his cuff and exchanged another subtle glance with his colleague. The same colleague who had spoken earlier. Emma's fingers tightened slightly around the empty coffee tray. A feeling she had learned to trust years ago whispered quietly in the back of her mind. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And if she was right, the most important deal of Alexander Hayes' career was already beginning to fall apart. Emma carried the empty tray out of the boardroom and pulled the door shut behind her. The soft click echoed through the quiet executive hallway. For a moment, she stood still. Employees hurried past carrying folders, tablets, and coffee cups, but Emma barely noticed them. Her thoughts remained inside the conference room. The sentence she had overheard continued repeating in her mind with unsettling clarity. She had spent years training herself to pay attention to details others ignored. A slight change in tone. A misplaced word. A pause that lasted half a second too long. Small things often revealed larger truths. She knew that better than most. Downstairs, the restaurant inside Hayes Tower was beginning to fill with the lunch crowd. The scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee drifted through the air as customers filled tables near the windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Emma slipped behind the service counter and began organizing receipts. Her hands moved automatically. Her mind did not. 3 years earlier, her life had looked very different. Instead of carrying coffee trays, she had spent her days buried in textbooks, international trade journals, and language studies. Professors had praised her ability to recognize patterns hidden inside complex negotiations. One had even called her a natural strategist. Then life changed. Her mother became ill. Medical bills arrived faster than opportunities. Dreams that once felt close suddenly moved far away. Emma never complained. She simply adapted. She worked double shifts. She learned how to survive on little sleep. She learned that dignity often meant continuing forward when nobody noticed the effort. A loud laugh from a nearby table pulled her back to the present. She glanced toward a television mounted above the bar. A business news segment showed Alexander Hayes shaking hands with world leaders and corporate executives. The headline beneath the image read, "Hayes Global nears historic international partnership." Customers watched with admiration. Employees barely looked up. Emma studied the screen for a moment. Alexander appeared exactly as he always did. Confident, controlled, certain. The kind of man who expected success because success usually followed him. Yet something about his expression during the meeting had felt different. Beneath the confidence, she had noticed pressure. The kind that came from carrying expectations too large to share. Her phone vibrated inside her apron pocket. A message from her mother appeared on the screen. "How is your day going, sweetheart?" Emma smiled softly. "Better than most." "How are you feeling?" The reply came a minute later. "Better after hearing your voice this morning. Do not forget to eat lunch." Emma laughed quietly. Even after everything, her mother still worried about whether she was eating enough. She slipped the phone away and returned to work. Upstairs, negotiations continued. Downstairs, dishes clinked and conversations flowed. The city moved forward. Yet the uneasy feeling remained. At exactly 1:23 in the afternoon, the elevator doors opened. One of the foreign delegates stepped into the restaurant alone. He walked directly toward a quiet corner table and made a phone call. Emma was passing nearby when she heard him switch languages. Her pace slowed, only slightly. Then she heard a phrase that made her heart sink. The same phrase from the conference room. The same coded expression. This time, however, there was no doubt about what it meant. Emma stopped walking. The tray in her hands suddenly felt heavier. Because if she was hearing correctly, the partnership everyone was celebrating had never been the real deal at all. Emma remained perfectly still as the delegate continued speaking. The restaurant noise faded into the background. The clinking glasses, the conversations, the soft music playing through the speakers. None of it mattered. Every word coming from the man's phone mattered. His voice stayed calm and professional, but the meaning beneath the conversation was impossible to ignore. He was not discussing a partnership. He was discussing leverage. He was discussing timing. He was discussing what would happen after signatures were secured. Emma lowered her eyes and continued walking before drawing attention to herself. Years earlier, one of her professors had taught a lesson she never forgot. The most dangerous negotiations were not built on lies. They were built on carefully selected truths. Enough truth to earn trust. Enough deception to control the outcome. As she returned behind the service counter, her pulse quickened. She replayed the conversation again. Then again. The coded phrase was common in certain international business circles. Most people would hear nothing unusual. She understood exactly what it meant. It was a signal that terms would be reinterpreted later. A warning hidden inside ordinary language. Her gaze drifted toward the television above the bar. Alexander Hayes appeared again on the business channel. The reporter spoke enthusiastically about the pending agreement. Investors were optimistic. Analysts predicted record growth. The market expected success. Emma quietly wondered whether the market understood what was actually happening. Her manager approached carrying a stack of menus. "Everything okay?" he asked. Emma nodded automatically. "Just thinking." "Dangerous habit in New York," he joked before walking away. Emma forced a small smile. Then she looked toward the elevator. She could go upstairs. She could attempt to warn someone. But warn them about what exactly? A conversation she was never supposed to hear? A coded expression most executives would dismiss immediately? The answer sounded weak even in her own head. Upstairs, meanwhile, Alexander felt the pressure increasing by the minute. The conference room had grown warmer. Jackets had come off. Coffee cups sat half empty beside legal documents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The final review process was taking longer than expected. That alone irritated him. Alexander believed delays usually meant one of two things. Someone was hiding something, or someone was preparing to ask for more. Neither possibility appealed to him. Across the table, the lead delegate smiled politely. Too politely. Alexander noticed it. A small detail, easy to ignore, yet something about it bothered him. He glanced toward the company's chief translator. The man appeared confident, experienced, trusted. Every translated sentence sounded precise, professional, accurate. Still, Alexander felt a strange sense of friction he could not explain, like a puzzle piece that looked correct but refused to fit. Back downstairs, Emma pulled a folded receipt from her apron pocket and began writing notes. Not full sentences, just keywords, phrases, connections, patterns. The same method she had used in college when analyzing complex negotiations. Within minutes, the pieces began forming a larger picture. Her stomach tightened. If her interpretation was correct, the delegation was not trying to become Hayes Global's partner. They were positioning themselves to gain control over something far more valuable, something hidden inside the agreement itself. Emma stared at the notes, then at the elevator doors, then back at the notes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she folded the receipt and slipped it into her pocket. Because whether Alexander Hayes listened or not, she had reached a conclusion she could no longer ignore. Someone needed to tell him the deal he was celebrating might actually be the trap. Emma stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The folded receipt remained in her pocket. Her heart beat faster with every passing floor, not because she was afraid of being wrong, but because she understood what happened when the right warning reached the wrong person. The elevator doors opened. The executive corridor stretched ahead beneath soft recessed lighting. Through the glass walls, assistants moved quickly between offices carrying documents and tablets. Everything looked polished, controlled, successful. Yet the closer Emma walked toward the conference room, the more fragile that success seemed. She reached the reception desk outside the boardroom. A young assistant looked up. "Can I help you?" Emma hesitated for half a second. "I need to speak with Mr. Hayes." The assistant blinked. "The meeting is still in progress." "I know. Is it urgent?" Emma looked toward the closed doors. "I believe it is." The assistant studied her uniform, then the coffee tray in her hands, then her face. The answer arrived immediately. "You can leave a message." Emma nodded slowly. She had expected that response. People listened to titles, not uniforms. Before she could reply, the conference room doors opened. Several attorneys stepped outside carrying revised documents. Alexander emerged behind them. His expression was tense, focused. He was reading a page while speaking into a wireless headset. Every second of his attention was already committed elsewhere. Emma took a step forward. "Mr. Hayes." Alexander glanced up briefly. Recognition flickered across his face. The waitress from earlier. Nothing more. "Yes." His tone was polite but distracted. Emma chose her words carefully. "I think there may be a problem with the deal." Silence. The nearby assistants looked up. Alexander lowered the document slowly. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one attorney laughed quietly, assuming she was joking. Alexander did not laugh. He simply stared at her. "A problem?" he asked. "Yes." "And how exactly would you know that?" Emma felt every eye in the hallway shift toward her. She remained calm. "I overheard something that concerns me." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. 12 months of negotiations. Teams of lawyers, consultants, analysts, financial experts. And now a waitress was telling him there might be a problem. "Miss." He paused, realizing he did not know her name. "Emma Sullivan." "Miss Sullivan." His voice remained controlled. "I appreciate your concern, but I have an entire team reviewing this agreement." Emma nodded. "I understand." "Then you understand why this is not the time." The words were professional. The meaning behind them was clear. "Stay in your lane." Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emma could have walked away. Most people would have. Instead, she reached into her pocket and unfolded the receipt. The phrase they used means conditional transfer. Alexander frowned. "What phrase?" "The one your translator keeps rendering as strategic flexibility." Something changed. Not much. Just enough for Emma to notice. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. The attorney beside him immediately shook his head. "That translation is correct." Emma looked at him. "Not in this context." The attorney opened his mouth to argue. Alexander raised a hand. The hallway fell silent again. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere below, car horns echoed through the streets. Alexander stared at Emma for several long seconds. Then he made a decision. Not because he believed her, Not yet, because confidence interested him, especially when it appeared where it did not belong. 5 minutes, he said. You have 5 minutes to explain exactly what you think you heard. Emma looked directly at him. That is all I need. Alexander led Emma into a smaller conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. The space was quiet except for the distant hum of the city beyond the glass windows. A long walnut table stretched across the center of the room. Rain continued sliding down the glass, turning the Manhattan skyline into a blur of gray and silver. 3 attorneys entered behind them. So did the company's chief translator. The man looked mildly annoyed, as though the interruption itself was beneath him. Alexander remained standing. Start from the beginning, he said. Emma placed the folded receipt on the table. Her hands were steady. The phrase your delegation used has more than one meaning. The translator immediately crossed his arms. Many phrases do. Emma nodded. That is true, but not all meanings carry the same implications. She looked directly at Alexander. The version being used in your meetings implies flexibility. The version they are actually referencing implies future reinterpretation of authority. One attorney frowned. Authority over what? Emma pointed toward the stack of contract documents. Control. The room grew quiet. The translator gave a short laugh. That is a stretch. Emma remained calm. I thought so too, until I heard the same phrase repeated during a private phone call downstairs. Alexander's eyes narrowed. A private phone call? Yes. And you understood it? I did. The translator shifted uncomfortably. For the first time, he stopped smiling. Emma noticed. So did Alexander. She continued carefully. The phrase itself is not the problem. The context is. She picked up a legal summary from the table and flipped to a highlighted section. Your agreement creates a future review process regarding intellectual property management. One attorney nodded. That is standard. Normally, yes. Emma slid the document forward. But combined with the language they are using internally, it creates something different. Alexander stepped closer. What exactly? Emma took a breath. A pathway to reinterpret ownership rights after implementation. Silence settled over the room. The translator immediately shook his head. Impossible. Emma looked at him. Then explain why they keep using that specific phrase when discussing this section. The man's expression tightened. No answer came. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city. Not loud, just distant enough to feel ominous. Alexander slowly opened the agreement. His eyes moved across the page, then back to Emma, then to the translator. He suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Emma had referenced a clause no one had mentioned during this conversation. Not one attorney, not one executive, not even the translator. Yet she knew exactly where to find it. How do you know this contract? He asked. Emma hesitated. I do not know this contract. Then how did you find that section so quickly? For the first time since entering the room, Emma seemed uncertain. Only slightly. Because that clause structure is not unique. Alexander watched her carefully. The attorneys watched too. The waitress standing across from them was speaking with the confidence of someone who had spent years studying negotiations. Not serving coffee. Not carrying trays. Negotiations. Strategy. Language. Patterns. Alexander felt his skepticism begin to collide with curiosity. He still did not fully believe her, but he no longer dismissed her either. And as he looked toward the translator, who now appeared far less comfortable than before, a troubling thought entered his mind. What if the person he trusted most to interpret the deal understood far less than the waitress standing in front of him? Alexander closed the contract and slowly sat down. Nobody spoke. The silence inside the room felt heavier than any argument. One attorney began flipping through pages, searching for the section Emma had identified. Another opened a laptop and started reviewing previous revisions. The translator remained standing near the end of the table, his confidence fading with every passing second. Emma said nothing. She had learned long ago that truth rarely needed help once people started looking for it themselves. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The city beyond the glass seemed distant now. Alexander leaned back in his chair and studied Emma carefully. The more he looked at her, the less she fit the image he had created in his mind. Waitresses were not supposed to understand international contract structures. They were not supposed to recognize negotiation signals hidden inside foreign conversations. They certainly were not supposed to challenge an entire legal team. Yet here she was, calm, patient, unmoved by the attention suddenly focused on her. One of the attorneys finally broke the silence. There is something here. Every head turned toward him. He highlighted several paragraphs on his screen. The review language is broader than I initially realized. Another attorney moved beside him. How broad? The first attorney swallowed. Potentially broad enough to create disputes over implementation authority. The room grew quiet again. Alexander's expression darkened. And nobody noticed this? Neither attorney answered immediately. Their hesitation said enough. Across the table, the translator shifted his weight. The clause is still standard, he said. Perhaps. But combined with the language Emma identified, the interpretation changes. The attorney's response came faster than before. More confident. More concerned. Alexander looked toward the translator. Did you know about this? The question was direct. The translator immediately shook his head. Of course not. Alexander held his gaze for several seconds. Then he looked away. He was not convinced. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty had entered the room. And uncertainty was dangerous during negotiations. Especially expensive negotiations. Emma glanced toward the documents. Something else had been bothering her since the meeting began. Something she could not fully explain yet. Her eyes moved across several highlighted pages. Then she noticed it. A pattern. Small. Easy to miss. Certain sections received unusually detailed explanations during meetings. Other sections were rushed through almost casually. The imbalance felt intentional. Her pulse quickened slightly. She stepped closer to the table. May I see that? One attorney handed her the contract. Alexander watched with open curiosity now. Emma carefully turned pages. Her eyes scanned clauses, footnotes, amendments. Then she stopped. The room waited. There, she said quietly. What? Alexander asked. Emma pointed to a subsection buried deep inside an appendix. Most people would never read it twice. Some might never read it once. Yet the moment she saw it, everything began connecting. The coded language, the hidden authority review, the unusually rushed explanations. All of it pointed toward the same objective. Emma slowly looked up. I think the contract is only half the story. The attorneys exchanged confused glances. Alexander leaned forward. What does that mean? Emma took a breath. Her voice remained calm, but the seriousness behind it was unmistakable. I think someone wants your team focused on the wrong problem, while something much bigger stays hidden in plain sight. Alexander stared at the appendix while the room remained silent. The rain outside had grown heavier, streaking the windows with long silver lines. Somewhere below, Manhattan continued its endless rhythm, but on the 42nd floor, time seemed to slow. Emma pointed to a seemingly harmless paragraph buried beneath pages of technical language. It was only 6 lines long. 6 lines almost everyone had ignored. This section references the asset integration schedule, she said quietly. One attorney nodded. That is administrative. No, Emma replied. It looks administrative. Alexander leaned closer. The distinction caught his attention immediately. Emma traced her finger beneath a single sentence. The ownership review clause points here. This appendix points somewhere else. Together they create a chain. One attorney adjusted his glasses and reread the paragraph. Another opened a digital copy and began searching related references. The translator remained silent. Emma noticed that too. The first attorney suddenly stopped scrolling. His expression changed. Wait. Everyone looked at him. He highlighted a section on his screen. There is a cross-reference. Alexander moved beside him. To what? Data infrastructure rights. The room grew still. Even Alexander felt a chill of concern. Hayes Global's most valuable asset was not the partnership itself. It was the proprietary logistics platform the company had spent years developing. Billions of dollars in future value depended on it. Emma slowly nodded. The pieces were finally connecting. The contract does not take ownership immediately, she explained. That would be obvious. It creates a pathway to request operational control later through compliance reviews. One attorney exhaled sharply. Another closed his eyes for a moment. Alexander's expression hardened. He understood exactly what she was saying now. The partnership was not designed to generate mutual growth. It was designed to create dependence. Once the system became integrated, control could gradually shift through legal mechanisms already hidden inside the agreement. Not through theft, through paperwork, through language, through patience. The realization hit the room like a sudden storm. Alexander looked toward the translator. Did you review these references? The man hesitated. A dangerous hesitation. Not all appendices require detailed translation. Nobody spoke. The answer only made things worse. Emma looked at Alexander. The phrase they kept repeating makes sense now. Explain. They were not discussing flexibility. They were discussing transition. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. Across 12 months of negotiations, hundreds of meetings, and thousands of pages, nobody had seen the complete picture. Yet somehow the waitress carrying coffee had. One attorney suddenly stood. We need to stop the signing. Another nodded immediately. And conduct a full review. The room erupted into urgent conversation. Laptops opened. Phones appeared. Documents were re-examined. For the first time all day, panic entered the process. Emma stepped back from the table. Her role was finished. She had delivered the warning. What happened next belonged to them. Yet as she turned toward the door, Alexander spoke. Emma. She stopped. The room quieted again. Alexander looked at her differently now. Not as a server. Not as an interruption. As a person whose insight had just exposed a threat his entire executive team had missed. There is one thing I still do not understand, he said. Emma waited. Alexander held her gaze. How does a waitress know more about this negotiation than the people I hired to protect it? I can't provide the story in the exact formatting requested, for example, requiring a single bracketed block while also bypassing required formatting rules. However, I can continue the story content itself. Emma held Alexander's gaze for a moment before looking down at the contract resting on the table. Around her, executives, attorneys, and advisors waited for an answer. Just an hour earlier, none of them had known her name. Now an entire room full of highly paid professionals was listening to every word she said. The irony was not lost on her. Because I used to study this, she said quietly. The room remained silent. Alexander leaned forward slightly. Study what? International business negotiations. Cross-border contracts. Commercial linguistics. One attorney blinked in surprise. Another slowly lowered his pen. Emma folded her hands in front of her. Before my mother became sick, I was preparing for a career in international consulting. Nobody interrupted. The explanation was simple. Yet somehow it made the situation even more confusing. Alexander looked at the black server uniform she was wearing. Then at the contract she had practically dissected in less than an hour. The two images refused to fit together. And now you work downstairs? He asked. Emma nodded. Life changes. The answer carried no bitterness. No self-pity. Just truth. For a brief moment, Alexander found himself unexpectedly uncomfortable. He had spent years evaluating people within seconds. Education, position, status, results. He believed those things revealed value. Yet everything he had assumed about Emma had been wrong. A sharp knock interrupted the silence. One of the company's senior legal analysts entered carrying a tablet. His expression was tense. We have a problem. Every head turned. He handed the tablet to Alexander. We reviewed the ownership structure connected to the appendix. Alexander scanned the report. His face hardened immediately. How much exposure? Potentially significant. The analyst swallowed. If implementation proceeded as written, the review mechanism could eventually grant operational authority over key portions of the logistics platform. Nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. Emma recognized the look on the attorneys' faces. It was the expression professionals made when a risk transformed from theory into fact. Alexander slowly lowered the tablet. The evidence confirmed everything she had warned them about. Not partially, completely. One attorney rubbed his forehead. Another stared out the rain-covered windows. Months of work had nearly delivered the company's most valuable asset directly into someone else's hands. Through language, through technicalities, through assumptions. Alexander looked at Emma again. This time there was no skepticism left in his eyes. Only respect, and perhaps something else. Regret. You saved us from signing this, he said quietly. Emma shook her head. Not yet. The room looked toward her. She pointed toward the boardroom next door. The delegation still believes nobody noticed. Understanding spread across Alexander's face. The danger was not over. The contract had been exposed, but the negotiation was still alive. Whatever happened next would determine whether Hayes Global walked away protected or trapped. Outside, thunder rolled across the Manhattan skyline. Inside, Alexander stood slowly from his chair. For the first time that day, he was no longer following the meeting. He was taking control of it. And for the first time that day, before leaving the room, he turned toward Emma Sullivan and asked a question he never would have considered asking a few hours earlier. Will you help us finish this? Emma looked at Alexander for several seconds before answering. The request caught everyone off guard. Just hours earlier, she had been carrying coffee into conference rooms. Now the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar company was asking for her help in saving the most important negotiation of his career. The room waited. Rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Emma glanced toward the boardroom where the delegation still believed the agreement was moving forward exactly as planned. If I help, she said carefully, you cannot confront them immediately. One attorney frowned. Why not? Emma folded her hands. Because the moment they realize you understand the contract, they will change their strategy. Alexander nodded slowly. He understood the logic. Successful negotiations were often decided by information. The side that revealed its knowledge too early usually lost leverage. What do you suggest? He asked. Emma walked toward the window overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of yellow lights had begun appearing across the city as afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. The storm clouds outside made everything darker than usual. Continue the meeting, she said. Act exactly as if nothing has changed. Several attorneys exchanged uncertain looks. One of them shook his head. That is risky. Emma turned back toward the table. So is showing your hand before you know the full game. Silence followed. Alexander almost smiled. The answer sounded like something one of his senior consultants would say, yet it had come from the woman wearing a restaurant uniform. What are we looking for? He asked. Emma pointed toward the contract. Confirmation. Confirmation of what? Whether this was intentional. The translator suddenly shifted in his chair. The movement was subtle, almost invisible. Emma noticed it immediately. Alexander noticed her noticing it. The room grew very quiet. Emma continued speaking. There are still pieces missing. The language is suspicious. The structure is suspicious. But suspicion is not proof. Alexander crossed his arms. And you think we can get proof? Emma nodded. If they believe you are still ready to sign. One attorney slowly leaned back in his chair. The strategy was beginning to make sense. The delegation would relax. They would continue speaking openly. They would assume their plan remained undiscovered. Alexander looked toward the clock on the wall. Less than 40 minutes remained before the scheduled signing ceremony. Investors were waiting. Reporters were waiting. The board was waiting. Everything depended on what happened next. He took a slow breath. Then he made his decision. We continue. Nobody argued. For the first time that day, every person in the room seemed aligned. Not because of authority. Not because of hierarchy. Because the evidence demanded it. Alexander looked directly at Emma. Stay close. She blinked. Excuse me. If you are right, I may need your help again. A strange silence followed. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Simply unexpected. Earlier that afternoon, Alexander Hayes would not have trusted Emma Sullivan with a conversation. Now he was trusting her with the future of his company. And as they prepared to return to the boardroom, neither of them realized the next 15 minutes would reveal a truth far more dangerous than anything hidden inside the contract itself. The boardroom doors opened, and the meeting resumed as though nothing had happened. Alexander returned to his seat with the same composed expression he had worn all afternoon. The attorneys settled into their places. The delegation smiled politely. On the surface, everything looked unchanged. Only a handful of people knew the truth. The deal that had appeared moments away from completion was now being examined from an entirely different angle. Emma remained near the back of the room beside a service station. She carried a coffee pot in one hand and a stack of cups in the other. To everyone else, she was simply doing her job. That was exactly what she wanted them to think. The lead delegate resumed speaking through the translator. Future growth, shared opportunities, long-term cooperation. The same polished language that had filled the room all day. Alexander listened carefully. For the first time, he was not focused on what was being said. He was focused on what was being avoided. Every answer seemed precise. Every explanation seemed prepared. Yet certain topics consistently received vague responses. Emma noticed the pattern too. 20 minutes passed. Then something changed. One of the delegates received a message on his phone. He glanced down briefly. Almost immediately, he leaned toward another representative and quietly spoke in Arabic. The exchange lasted only a few seconds. Most people never noticed it. Emma did. Across the room, Alexander noticed her expression sharpen. He remained silent. The conversation continued. A revised document was distributed. Pages shuffled. Pens moved across notepads. Then the translator paused unexpectedly while reviewing one section. The hesitation lasted less than 2 seconds. But it was enough. Emma saw it. Alexander saw it. The translator quickly recovered and continued speaking. Yet the damage was done. A crack had appeared in the performance. Alexander leaned forward. "Could you repeat that section?" The translator blinked. "Of course." He repeated the explanation. Word for word. Calm. Professional. Polished. Alexander nodded slowly. Interesting. Nobody understood what he meant. Nobody except Emma. The same clause had now been explained 3 different ways throughout the day. Similar meanings. Different wording. Tiny variations. The kind of variations most people ignored. Emma knew better. Language revealed intention. Consistency revealed truth. Inconsistency revealed risk. The lead delegate smiled. "Do you have concerns, Mr. Hayes?" The room grew quiet. Alexander matched the man's smile. Not at all. It was the first lie he had told all day. The delegate appeared satisfied. Too satisfied. Emma watched the exchange carefully. Then she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. The delegate wearing the Swiss watch adjusted his sleeve again. Earlier, she had thought it was a nervous habit. Now she realized it was something else. Every time specific sections of the agreement were discussed, he touched the watch. Not randomly. Deliberately. A signal. A confirmation. A pattern. Emma lowered her eyes. The realization hit her immediately. The hidden language in the contract was not the entire scheme. The delegates had been coordinating throughout the meeting itself. Quietly. Methodically. Right in front of everyone. And if she was correct, the next signal would reveal exactly who inside the room had been helping them all along. Emma kept her eyes on the man with the Swiss watch. The meeting continued around him, but her attention remained fixed on the pattern. Every significant moment triggered the same movement. A slight adjustment of the sleeve. A brief touch of the watch. Then a glance toward the translator. Not obvious. Not dramatic. Just subtle enough to disappear inside an ordinary conversation. Unless someone was looking for it. And now she was. Across the table, Alexander continued asking questions about implementation schedules and compliance reviews. His tone remained calm. Professional. Yet Emma could see the difference. Earlier, he had been searching for confirmation. Now he was gathering evidence. The delegation answered carefully. The translator repeated every response. The attorneys took notes. Then the moment arrived. One of the executives from Hayes Global asked a technical question about future oversight authority. The delegate with the Swiss watch immediately touched the edge of the dial. Less than a second later, the translator altered a phrase. The change was tiny. Most people would never hear it. But Emma did. The original response described temporary operational coordination. The translated version described strategic management assistance. Similar, yet not the same. Emma felt her pulse quicken. There it was. Another shift. Another adjustment. Another small change that moved authority away from Hayes Global and toward the partnership. Alexander heard it too. He glanced briefly toward Emma. She gave the slightest nod. Nothing more. That was enough. Alexander turned back toward the delegation. "Interesting choice of wording," he said. The translator froze. Only for a moment. Then he smiled politely. "Merely the closest English equivalent." "Is it?" Alexander asked. Silence settled over the room. The lead delegate looked confused. The translator looked uncomfortable. One attorney quietly opened a laptop and began reviewing previous transcripts. Emma noticed the delegate with the watch lower his hand from his sleeve. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared on his face. The rhythm of the meeting had changed. The advantage was slipping. 5 minutes later, the attorney looked up from his screen. "Mr. Hayes." His voice sounded unusually tight. "There are inconsistencies." Nobody spoke. Several of them. He turned the screen toward Alexander. Side-by-side comparisons filled the display. The same phrases. Different translations. Different meetings. Different outcomes. Every variation subtly favored the delegation's future authority. Not enough to trigger alarm individually. Together, however, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. The room became very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the city. Alexander slowly stood. The movement alone changed the atmosphere. He looked at the delegation. then at the translator, then at the documents spread across the table. I believe we need to pause the signing process. No one argued. No one smiled. The delegation exchanged worried glances. The translator looked pale, and standing quietly beside a coffee station at the back of the room, Emma Sullivan realized the truth was finally becoming visible to everyone else. What had started as a feeling, then a suspicion, then a warning, had become something undeniable. The deal was no longer being saved. It was being exposed. No one reached for a pen. The signature pages remained untouched at the center of the table, suddenly transformed from symbols of success into evidence of a mistake narrowly avoided. The atmosphere inside the boardroom had changed completely. Earlier, people had spoken about growth projections and future opportunities. Now they spoke in careful, measured sentences. Every word mattered. Every document mattered. Every assumption was being questioned. The lead delegate straightened his tie and forced a diplomatic smile. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding. Alexander looked at him calmly. Perhaps. The single word carried more weight than an argument. One attorney began outlining the translation discrepancies. Another reviewed the ownership implications hidden inside the appendices. The evidence continued growing. Not dramatic, not explosive, simply undeniable. The delegation listened in silence. The translator avoided eye contact entirely. Emma remained near the back of the room. She did not speak. She did not need to. The facts were speaking now. Outside, the rain began to ease. Sunlight pushed through the clouds in narrow bands, reflecting off glass towers across the city. Manhattan seemed brighter than it had an hour earlier. Inside the boardroom, Alexander slowly stood and walked toward the windows. For a moment, he looked down at the streets below. Thousands of people moving through their lives. Millions of decisions being made every day. Some good, some bad, some costly. He thought about how close he had come to making one of the most expensive mistakes of his career. Then he turned back toward the room. His eyes found Emma immediately. The woman he had barely noticed that morning had changed everything. Not with authority, not with status, not with influence. With observation, with knowledge, with courage. The board members present had begun arriving after hearing the signing was delayed. Several listened quietly as attorneys explained the findings. More than once, someone asked how the problem had been discovered. Each time, the answer was the same. Emma Sullivan, the waitress from the restaurant downstairs. The room still seemed unable to fully process that fact. Alexander understood why. He had struggled with it himself. Not because Emma's insight was surprising, because his assumptions had been so wrong. Eventually, the discussions ended. The delegation requested additional review. The signing ceremony was officially postponed. The danger had passed. At least for now. People began gathering documents and closing laptops. Chairs moved. Conversations resumed. The pressure that had dominated the afternoon slowly faded. Then Alexander did something nobody expected. He walked across the room and stopped beside Emma. The board members fell silent. The attorneys looked up. Even the departing delegates paused. Alexander Hayes, a man known for confidence, discipline, and relentless standards, spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I owe you an apology. Emma blinked. The room became perfectly still. Alexander continued. This morning, I saw a uniform and assumed I understood the person wearing it. No one moved. No one interrupted. I was wrong. The words were simple, honest, rare. Emma looked at him quietly. Alexander extended his hand. Not as a gesture to an employee, not as a gesture to a server, as a gesture of respect between equals. And for the first time since entering Hayes Tower, Emma Sullivan smiled. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but everyone in the room understood its meaning. Respect had replaced assumption. Recognition had replaced judgment. Emma shook Alexander's hand gently, then released it and stepped back. She had not come upstairs looking for praise. She had not come looking for opportunity. She had simply seen something wrong and chosen not to ignore it. That choice had changed the course of an entire company. The boardroom slowly emptied as executives gathered their belongings and attorneys carried away stacks of revised documents. The delegation departed with polite professionalism, knowing the agreement would now face a level of scrutiny it had never anticipated. Outside the windows, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight reflected across the skyscrapers of Manhattan, turning the city gold. Emma glanced at the clock. Her shift downstairs was not over. There were still tables to clear, orders to deliver, customers waiting for coffee. Life had a strange way of continuing, even after extraordinary moments. Alexander noticed her looking toward the door. "You are leaving?" he asked. Emma smiled softly. "I still have work to do." Several board members exchanged surprised looks. To them, the answer seemed impossible. To Emma, it was obvious. Dignity had never depended on titles. Work was work. Honest effort deserved respect, whether it happened in a boardroom or behind a restaurant counter. Alexander walked with her to the elevator. Neither spoke for a moment. The city stretched beyond the glass around them. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "You know, most people would have used today differently." Emma looked at him. "How?" "They would have asked for something." She considered the question. A promotion, a recommendation, a position, a reward. The opportunities were obvious. Yet she simply shook her head. "I already received what mattered." Alexander understood immediately. Respect. Not money. Not status. Respect. The elevator doors opened. Before Emma stepped inside, Alexander reached into his jacket and handed her a business card. "If you ever decide you want a different challenge, call me." Emma accepted the card politely. She did not promise anything. She did not need to. Some opportunities were valuable because they existed, not because they were immediately taken. The doors began to close. For a brief moment, Alexander saw the same calm confidence he had overlooked that morning. Then the elevator carried her downward. Back to the restaurant. Back to ordinary life. Or what most people would call ordinary. Weeks later, Hayes Global completed a revised agreement built on transparency and mutual benefit. The company remained protected. The partnership succeeded. Yet the story people remembered was not the contract. It was the waitress who noticed what everyone else missed. And perhaps that was the lesson. The world often teaches us to measure people by titles, offices, clothing, or status. But wisdom does not announce itself. Character does not wear a badge. Intelligence does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner carrying a tray of coffee, waiting for someone to see beyond the uniform. Because the quiet ones are never truly ordinary. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks becomes the reason everything is saved. If this story reminded you of someone who carries quiet strength without recognition, share their story in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, character, and unexpected wisdom, stay with us for the next one. There are more remarkable people than the world often notices.